Hello and welcome to a new episode of Climate Watch. I'm Fei Fei. Today I'm taking you to the vast and beautiful South Pacific, where more than a dozen of island countries situated. They may be the perfect destination for your holidays. They have very beautiful coastlines, vibrant cultures, warm weathers, and also delicious food. But on the other side of the story, they're also facing a sobering reality. These countries, spread across tens of thousands of islands on the ocean, are facing existential threats from the changing climate. If you follow international climate negotiations, you've probably heard an alliance called Small Island Developing States, SIDS. They've been speaking out about their desperate situation and their urgent need for international support. But just how serious is this crisis they face? And are help really reaching out to them? And are the pledges from more developed nations translating into real and practical support? And to unpack these questions, I'm joined today by Professor Patrick Nunn from the sunny Australia. He's the Professor of Geography from the University of the Sunshine Coast. Patrick was trained in the UK as both a geographer and a geologist, and he specializes in how sea level changes shape landscape. He spent much of his academic career at the University of South Pacific, which makes him the perfect guest for today's topic about Pacific Island nations and their fight against climate change. Hello, Patrick. Thanks for joining us today on Climate Watch.
Thank you very much, Fei. It's an honor to be with you today. Thank you.
So let's start from the beginning, where a lot of island nations, particularly in the South Pacific, have been speaking out about their crisis in dealing with climate change. Can you first help us understand how serious is their situation there?
It's very serious in many parts of the Pacific Islands region. And what they are mainly worried about is the rise in the ocean surface, the sea level rise, because in many island nations in the Pacific, there are hundreds and hundreds of islands, and people are living on many of these islands. And most people in the Pacific Islands live along island coastlines. So they are very aware and very easily affected by a rise in the ocean surface, a rise in sea level. And in many parts of the Pacific, particularly in the Western Pacific, in areas like Micronesia and Solomon Islands, the sea level is currently rising about 4 or 5 times faster than the global average. So the rise of sea level is very acute in some parts of the Pacific and has already caused entire islands to be submerged. It's already caused massive erosion and land loss along many Pacific Island coasts. Sea level rise is not the only challenge associated with climate change, but I think it's the main and the most widespread challenge in the Pacific Islands region.
And you've been studying actually on the rise of sea levels to these small island countries for half a century now. So I assume that the science behind the understanding of the rising sea level and their impacts are well understood among scholars and scientists. But in practice, how have the Pacific Island countries been dealing with the rising sea levels and also with the problems you mentioned, like the erosion of lands and the submerging of some parts of their lands or even their island as a whole?
The science of climate change is very well understood. I've been associated with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for 30 years now, the IPCC, and the science that they produce is very well understood. It's very good and of a very high standard. Now, the biggest challenge, I think, around future climate change is not understanding what is likely to happen, but it's convincing people, not just in the Pacific Islands, but everywhere in the world, about how to prepare for future climate change. In the Pacific Islands, I think one key challenge is having people who don't necessarily have a good understanding of science understand what is likely to happen in the future. And this is not being judgmental, but many Pacific Island communities, particularly in rural areas, have very little understanding of science, but they see the world through a spiritual lens. So they apply their religious understandings of the world to their observations of sea level rise and of stronger tropical cyclones or typhoons. And they say, well, why is this happening? Why is God doing this to us? What does God want us to do in response to these kinds of things? So it's sometimes challenging for outsiders to understand what Pacific Islanders are thinking about climate change and therefore how they should prepare for climate change. So there's a bit of a clash between outside agendas for climate change adaptation and insider views on how to adapt to climate change.
That's very interesting. And I agree with the clash point that you mentioned, because from our perspective, who've been taught for decades and even centuries that we should believe in science and the science in the natural world. And for example, when a cyclone happened, that means something happened in the air or with the ocean. But residents on the island countries are seeking answers or possibly solutions from the spirituality point of view. And how do you see these, I would say, distinct point of view will impact on their adaptation or building the resilience when facing with the changing climate?
The first thing I would say is that there are, of course, many people in the Pacific Islands who do not have a spiritual view of climate change. But in many rural communities, that certainly is the view. And the way that I look at it is to say we must not get too tied up in the causes of climate change. We must just observe what is happening and decide how best to respond to it. It doesn't really matter whether it's the warming of the air or whether it's a natural phenomenon or whether it's God. What matters is what is actually happening and the impacts that it's having on the way people are living. And therefore, what can we do about that? Because otherwise, you go down the path where it's very difficult to accommodate everyone's view of why things are happening. And I'm neutral about this. When you go into a Pacific Island community, it's no good me as an outsider saying, you must believe in science. And if you don't believe in science, then you are foolish and uneducated. That's not correct. You go in and you listen to people and you understand how they view the world. And you say, well, your view of the world still allows you to do something about the rising ocean and about the stronger typhoons and about the global heating that you're experiencing. There are ways to adapt to these things. The cause is less important than adapting to the effects, in my view.
And since you mentioned about the perspective of the rural communities in the Pacific Islands, I assume there are also the urban communities that are dealing with the same issue on those islands as well. Can you also shed some light on how the urban communities been dealing with rising oceans, and what's the difference between the urban and the rural communities?
That's a good question. And I think the answer is that urban communities, because they are more visible to outsiders, they get a lot of donor funding. So countries, including China, but including Australia, the European Union, they're coming in and they are giving money for climate change adaptation. And the most visible place to spend that money is in urban centers. So you will often see that capital cities in different island countries actually have very good coastal protection structures, most of which have been built with outside funding. And in a way, urban centers are not representative of what is happening in many parts of the Pacific Islands region. But that said, when you go to the outside parts of urban centers, you'll find a lot of informal or squatter settlement. And many of these places have huge problems associated with sea level rise and large waves and things like that, because they are not the central part of the urban centers.
That's very awakening in a sense that I think for us, even though we've been hearing about the voices from these small island countries, I think a lot of us tend to lump them together. These are a big group of islands and they're sort of one place. And for a lot of us, we didn't realize there is differences between different nations, different even groups, and differences between urban and rural settings. And I think that's something that we can think more about. I want to check with you with some of the governmental plans that's been quite famous internationally. For example, there are countries in South Pacific that have this plan that in the worst case scenario, they're considering migrating to another continent, to another country as a whole nation. What do you see of that strategy to deal with the rising ocean?
Well, thank you, Faye. That's another very good question. But I want to address your first part of your response first, just very briefly.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. Outsiders do see the Pacific Islands as uniform, when in fact they are very diverse in their nature. Um, a lot of people outside the Pacific think all the islands are these very, very low islands where, the land doesn't go more than 2 or 3 meters above sea level. But that's actually a very, very small number of islands. But of course, their problems are much more visible to the outside world. But our research is showing that in the western part of the Pacific, the number of people who are exposed to sea level rise because they live along island coasts is far greater on high islands than it is on these low islands. Something like 10 times the number of people in countries like Solomon Islands and Vanuatu and Fiji are exposed to rising sea levels 10 times more than there are on these low-lying atoll islands. But your question was about migration. And I think on the low-lying islands, the island groups in places like Tuvalu and Kiribati, the Marshall Islands maybe, these islands will not last forever. If the sea level continues to rise as it is projected in the IPCC reports, then by the end of this century, it's going to be perhaps nearly, 70 or 80 centimeters higher than it is today. These low-lying islands will be uninhabitable long before that because they are essentially piles of sand and gravel sitting on a coral reef. So we can do things on those islands that will extend their life, if you like, but will not extend it indefinitely. So people will have to move from those island countries to other countries. But it's going to be a problem for other island countries as well. So the three countries that I mentioned, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Fiji, there will be hundreds of thousands of people forced to move from the coasts of these islands inland. They will be forced to move up the slopes of those islands behind the coastline the present-day coastline, because of the rise of sea level. So there is going to be mobility or migration within islands as well as between islands. And I think the sooner governments in the region plan for this kind of mobility or migration in the future, the better.
So you're seeing migration could only be one solution in dealing with rising ocean, but can't represent every community in every country in that region. There must be some other adaptive methods in dealing with the rising ocean. I read in your piece that you praised one of the countries' plans to actually investing in some infrastructure. And even though it was sort of a short-term adaptive methods, but they can still be effective. And they sort of provides people with the time and sort of provide the buffering zone for them to think about long-term strategies. And do you see that kind of upgrading their infrastructure taking place on a broader scale on these island nations?
Well, there's a number of questions in there. And absolutely, I think the way that the island nation of Kiribati, which is all low-lying islands, the way that that nation has decided that they will reject the sort of Western labeling of vulnerable and helpless, and they will help themselves. I think that is an incredibly positive step because most outsiders in other parts of the world, they look at the Pacific Islands and they think, oh, these places are so vulnerable and the people are so helpless, which is not the case. I say to my students, people have lived on islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for more than 3,000 years. How did they do that? It wasn't just luck. They did it because they learned how to live in these changing dynamic environments. And so I think these largely Western narratives of vulnerability and helplessness are not very useful. And so I was very happy to see Kiribati decide, with the help of China, to try and fight back against the rise of sea level by building up some of the islands in Kiribati. And it doesn't really matter whether these will only last for another 20, 30, or 40 years. The point is that people are taking control of their own destiny rather than being subject to these kinds of negative global narratives. So I felt that was a very positive step. You also asked about what's happening in other parts of the Pacific. I think at the moment, so much money is being offered to the Pacific Islands to help adapt to climate change that the temptation to represent your country as vulnerable and needy is very great. But I see a big difference between what island leaders are saying about their countries being vulnerable and needy and what is actually happening on the ground, because many communities are in fact helping themselves. They are in fact saying, we are strong, we understand what we need to do, and we will do it. We
Mm.
will move ourselves. We will make ourselves less vulnerable. So these things are happening. So there's a difference between the sort of national, outward looking representation of islands and what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, because for years, I think, especially on international climate meetings and negotiations, the small island nation, they form an alliance called SIDS. They are very vocal about the need for international support, and in most recent years, about the lost and damaged fund that's been promised but not been delivered. But I think, as you mentioned, about the national leaders' vulnerability narrative is sort of justified because a lot of developing countries, not only small island countries, they believe that the reason that they're facing this climate crisis is because of some historical development done by the developed nations, and developed nations need to take on the responsibility to help everyone on this planet to deal with the crisis that we are facing today. And I think that's justified. I'm also curious about your take on that. And another question that I have, since you mentioned that a lot of residents and locals on the islands believe they're strong and they're capable of dealing with climate change, but what resources do they have on their hands that they can utilize and leverage?
Okay, well, I suppose the first thing is yes, of course, loss and damage is justified. Of course, the damage that has been done to the Pacific Islands by other countries is something that is legitimate. But I would make the point, Faye, that if Pacific Island countries continue to depend on other people's money to adapt to climate change, that is not sustainable in the long term. At the end of the day, Pacific Islands might find themselves truly isolated as other countries are using all this money to help themselves. And Australia is a good example. It's not the only example, but it's a good example because it's being talked about in Australia about how we're being too generous to Pacific Island countries for climate change adaptation. And maybe we should think about what's going to happen to, the big cities in Eastern Australia, to Brisbane, to Sydney, to Melbourne. We need to protect these places, and it's going to cost billions and billions of dollars to get it right. So maybe we should pull back on how much we are helping the Pacific. And I've written about this, and I've said that Pacific Island countries need to be helped in different ways by outsiders. The outsiders need to help Pacific Island countries become less dependent, more autonomous in terms of their climate change adaptation. So while I think international funding is, of course, justified, I don't think that the continued use of international funds or outside funds is a sustainable trend. And so I think for that reason, it's actually quite dangerous. I think in 10 years' time, if the amount of money that Pacific Islands are receiving drops by 50%, Pacific Island countries are going to say, well, what do we do now? How do we help ourselves? So we need, I think, to start today and think about, well, how can Pacific Island countries become better at helping themselves rather than depending on outside assistance?
That reminds me of a saying in China that instead of giving you fish, it's better to teach you about fishing. And that
Absolutely correct.
Yeah, so that comes back to my question about what resources do you think these island countries have that they can make use of to support in building up their resilience and their adaptation?
Well, I would go back to my previous comment that people have lived on islands in the Western Pacific for more than 3,000 years. And the fact they survived was not because of luck. They survived because they learned how to live in those environments. And they didn't need money to adapt, but they adapted to rises and falls of the sea level. They adapted to extreme events. They adapted and they survived. So what resources do they have today? They have their traditional knowledge. So they have knowledge about what their ancestors did and how their ancestors understood their environments. I was reading a study recently about Vanuatu, and in the southern parts, the southern islands of Vanuatu, they have more than 100 trees that they observe in the forest. And when those trees change, they know things are happening elsewhere. So they are called calendar plants. Calendar plants. The idea is that when one of those trees starts to change in a certain way, that signals that other things are happening in the environment. So people are optimally understanding of their natural environment. And I think there are other lessons to be learned from the Pacific. In the past, Pacific peoples built houses that were designed to withstand the strongest storms. Today we think, oh, we must build houses out of bricks and cement and things like that to make them strong. But Pacific peoples in the past, they had houses designed in particular ways and built of certain materials that allowed those houses to withstand very strong winds. So there's a lot of knowledge and there's a lot of material out there in the Pacific Islands that can help people adapt into the future. But I think, Faye, the most dangerous thing is to say it costs money because it doesn't cost money. You know, even 50, 60 years ago in Pacific Island countries, communities had 1 or 2 days set aside where everyone would do something for the communal good. So communities knew how to help themselves. They were designed in that way. And I think a lot of that knowledge it would benefit from being revived and reintroduced to Pacific Island contexts.
And do you think, since it sounds like it's such an abundant resources when it comes to traditional wisdom and knowledge, do you think there have been enough studies now looking at these traditional resources that they have?
Oh, no. I think not just in the Pacific Islands, but everywhere in the world, of course, including China. There is a lot of traditional knowledge and traditional understandings of the world and the environment that are being lost, particularly as a result of the globalization of societies in the Pacific. Young people are now, on their phones and they are looking at Facebook and the internet and things like that. They are not listening to the stories of their grandparents and their parents. So a lot of that knowledge is going to be lost very quickly. And I think there is a very good case for richer countries to actually invest money in documenting these kinds of traditional knowledges before they are completely lost. Not just, of course, in the Pacific, but everywhere in the world. I think it's very sad that our ancestors' understandings of the world will not be remembered in 50 or 100 years' time. So I think documentation of this knowledge is not simply a good thing to do, but it's also a useful thing to do because a lot of that knowledge can be applied into the future.
And a lot of those knowledge remain unknown to the especially outside world. And I think that's one of the ways that international funds can go into, right? Into
That's right.
documenting this traditional knowledge and wisdoms.
That's right. And one thing I would say, Faye, just quickly, is that I think the way forward for climate change adaptation in island countries in the Pacific is to bring traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge together and to say traditional knowledge can tell us about how to live in this place, and scientific knowledge can tell us what is likely to happen in the future. So bringing them together represents the basis for successful future adaptation.
And since we're talking about funding, there actually has been tremendous funding going into these Pacific Islands for years. And you've also mentioned about these donor countries as well. And how would you evaluate the effectiveness of these programs that's been supported by other countries?
Um, I have been very critical of the funding that has been provided from outside to Pacific Island countries for climate change adaptation over 40 years. And I don't see a lot of change. There's not a lot of change in the way people are interacting with their environments. I see coastal communities in particular that are just as exposed today as they were 30 or 40 years ago. So a lot of that outside donor funding for climate change adaptation has been absorbed by Pacific Island governments. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying it doesn't filter down necessarily to communities. A lot of that funding has been, I think, it's not been well designed. It's not been based on an understanding of Pacific Island needs. It's been based on outsiders' impressions of Pacific Islands and what they need. So a lot of the strategies for donor funding have been designed and driven by outsiders rather than people asking the Pacific. So, that, like I said earlier, there's this assumption that Pacific Island people are helpless and that they don't understand things and they are vulnerable. And a lot of that is because a lot of them don't speak English as their first language. So, if you have someone from the UK or from Australia or from the United States going in to the Pacific and they try to speak English and people go, they don't really understand. The outsider will make the assumption that people really don't understand, whereas in fact, it's the language of communication which is the problem, not the knowledge. So I think there's a lot of money that has been wasted in the Pacific Islands trying to build climate change adaptation, trying to build resilience. And resilience is a word that's often used. Outsiders will say Pacific Island peoples need to have their resilience built. And I will say that's nonsense. These are some of the most resilient people on Earth. They've lived on these islands for thousands of years. How can you say they are not resilient? Oh, well, they don't look resilient to me. And it's these kinds of assumptions I find really annoying.
So
Faye, sorry.
is that also the reason that you've been critical about, for example, the building of seawalls in the cities of these islands?
Well, not so much in the cities because they can be maintained, but in the rural parts of the Pacific, along rural communities' coastlines, it's a really bad idea to build a seawall. Really bad, because you're replacing a beach like this, which is permeable, and you're replacing it with a vertical, impermeable seawall. And everyone knows what will happen. I often say that seawalls in the rural parts of the Pacific Islands, they will last between 18 and 24 months before they fall down. Then what happens? You're back to where you were before. So seawalls are very unhelpful.
And since I'm based in China, and I have also asked this question, that China has also been engaging with Pacific Island nations as well, especially in recent years. And climate cooperation is one of the key areas when it comes to the cooperation between China and various Pacific Island nations. Did China bring on the table something different from what's been brought to the island nations before?
I'm not the great expert here, Faye. I only really have an impression of what has been happening. But yes, I think China has listened where some other donor countries have made assumptions about what's going on. And I think listening is very important. I think outsiders tend to come into the Pacific and they make up their minds depending on what they see. And I think that's dangerous. I don't think that's very helpful. So I think anyone coming from outside who listens to Pacific Island people, what do you want, is a very good thing. And I think China, and some other donors, but China especially, can be commended for that. I heard from a friend in the Pacific a few years ago. They said, we like China because China comes and builds a road, whereas Europe just gives you a lecture. And I'm not saying that's true in every case, but China has a reputation for being more practical about climate investments in the Pacific, and less about setting the agenda, less about talking, more about action.
Before I let you go, I do have this last question. Like, ultimately, regardless of what kind of help coming from the outside, do you believe that Pacific Island nations are able to find their own ways, to find their own solutions to the crisis, to the rising oceans, or other problems being brought by the changing climate?
I think, of course, it's possible. And But I will say that I think the present situation in which every year I see Pacific Island countries becoming more dependent on outside funding for climate change adaptation is really dangerous. It's unsustainable because that outside money may not continue to flow, and almost certainly it's going to fall. So Pacific Island countries need to think now about how they will help themselves into the future. And there will be, Fei, major changes in the geography of the Pacific Islands going into the future. Many coastlines will become uninhabitable. People will have to move upslope. They will have to think about where do they get their water from? Where do they get their food from? If they can't use the coasts that they are accustomed to. Some islands will go underwater. Some islands will become uninhabitable, and people will have to move from those islands elsewhere. It can all be done, but at the moment, I don't see an understanding out there in the Pacific region that it needs to be done.
That needs some long-term thinking, really.
Exactly.
And also,
Exactly.
and also when it comes to change, it's always painful to change your
Exactly.
old ways of life and to convince people to
Exactly.
change, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. There was a village that was moved recently in Fiji from the coast up into the hills, and it's called Vunindongaloa. And the people there were telling me they couldn't move because the old people in that village said, "No, we're not moving." And it wasn't until those old people died that the village was able to move. So you're right. People are very attached to place in the Pacific Islands, like they are everywhere in the world, but in the Pacific Islands. And so sometimes it takes a long time for people to respond.
But then at the same time, there's still long-term planning that these countries can do to help themselves in the future,
Of course, of
especially
course,
with the science well understood what's going to happen very soon. Thank you,
that's right.
Patrick. Thank you very much for your time today.
You are most welcome, Faye. It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
A huge thank you to Professor Patrick Nunn from the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia for sharing his insights. And thank you for listening and watching to this episode of Climate Watch. If you enjoyed today's conversation or have any suggestions for future episodes, don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can also reach out to me at my email address, fei.fei@cgtn.com, fei.fei@cgtn.com. I'd love to hear from you. Also, you can reach out to me on Substack. I write a newsletter called Rivers and Mountains. Until next time.